Fantastic. Hi, good morning. My name is Ignacio Cruz. I'm here at Northwestern University, and I have the great pleasure of introducing you to our first session. Our first session, I think, is very interesting and has a lot of intriguing ideas around AI adoption at work, human and digital work configurations, as well as kind of the implications of social networks on AI and online labor markets. So our first speaker, without further ado, is Mary Beth Watson-Manheim. Mary Beth is a professor and head of managerial studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago, as well as professor of information studies and communication. The title of her talk today is Adoption of AI in Context, Human Digital Configuration Work and Its Implications. So a big round of applause for Mary Beth.
Thank you, Ignacio. Happy to be here. As Ignacio said, I have kind of had a long interest in technology and kind of at the intersection of work and organization and management, and have been very interested in communication through that. You can almost, those three, that intersection is really what's driven me for my career. So today I want to talk about the idea of AI in context. And I do want to acknowledge, and I'll talk, this is my thinking about this, but really informed a lot by work that I've done with Stefan Klein, and Sophie Meyer and Franz Strick, who are all Stefan at the University of Munster, and Sophie at the Ken Institute, and Franz Strick in Amsterdam. And students in my PhD seminar in the last semester, we talked a lot about this work. I chose this picture of the human and the robot in this case, but the human working with the AI. And I want to talk about, let's see how does this work. I'm particularly interested in today professional work that we're seeing more and more discussion of how many jobs are going to be lost as AI comes in and takes over tasks that professionals are doing. And this is just a graph that's pretty hard to read, but this is from the Financial Times in March, this past March 27th. Surrender your desk job to the AI productivity miracle, says Goldman Sachs. And if you look at the jobs in here, you have office administrative support, but you have legal, you have architecture and engineering. You have a number of professional jobs that they say are exposed to industry employment, reducing their jobs and lowering the need for employment in these areas. And the gist of this article also was that developed nations are more at risk than developing because these higher skilled jobs are in those areas. So I'd like to talk about what I contend maybe some implications of AI adoption in professional work. And particularly, I'm not sure that we are understanding completely what work is and how it is actually taking place in the context that it happens. And by context, I mean the entire job, including the history, the length of time, the relationships, the physical location that takes place in the material objects, as well as for this group, the extra constellation that the individual is embedded in. All of these aspects, I contend, really have not been taken into account, and the understanding of what the job is what actually is entailed in that job is often not even understood by the individual who's performing that job. If they told you what they were doing, they probably would not tell you the entire scope of activities that go into their job. I also think that perhaps we are privileging technology in this process. We are trying to match, we are taking the immediate process that's leading to an outcome and matching it to technology. We're trying to enhance the current process as we understand it. And we're looking for, usually the goal is more efficient, more consistent outcomes. I would like to talk about the fact that job will be reconfigured as AI is dropped in, or AI as task or delegated. and that it will lead to emergent and consequential changes that will ripple through the organization and lead to organizational change. So what I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit about the kind of underpinning in terms of what do I mean by configuration work, and what do I mean by how does that translate to organizational transformation. And I want to show two examples, one in the banking industry, financial services industry, and in robotic surgery. So first, we borrowed this idea, or tried to build on Lucy Suchman's configuration work idea, by saying that configuration work is using the technology and figuring out in the context and making sense of that technology as we perform the work. So configuring it is a human working with the technology, and this requires human innovation and cognitive labor, and it's often hidden work. It's work that's done, it's experimentation, it happens over time, and it's fundamentally embodied. It's as I'm working with that technology. And people make sense of the technology in context and shape their identity in this case. I mean, especially with AI, I think, as you all are aware, I mean, when we had many information systems could be set aside and were very predictable. AI is a part of and learns and changes and is changed as you are using it, as the individual is using it in context. So we contend that configuration and reconfiguration happens over time and in specific settings, and that's what leads to organizational change. And to make that a little more, this is from some work that we did on that's published in the Journal of Strategic Information Systems. And this idea of the three orders of change is based on, or is adapted from Bartanuk and Noak in 1987. But their idea is that the individual, and we translated this to technology, the individual, as they begin to use a new technology, has a specific way of thinking about their job. And that is, as they integrate the technology into the work they're doing, they are thinking about, how do I do it better? How do I do what I currently understand my job to be? How do I do it better? And here, that's a first order change, where my thinking about the job is current, the convergent change. As I begin to work with this, there's a transformation where the work will change. So if I am bringing in, and I'll talk about loan officers whose job, the decision was automated, that meant that the way that they did their job changed. They were working with the technology, and I'll talk a little bit about changes that people made that were intended and unintended. But at this point, you're thinking more about the work is being transformed, and you're figuring out what new configurations do I engage in order to perform my job. And actually, how do I think about work now? What is my work? My work has changed. And how do I think about that? As I begin to think about how that changing nature of work, how my work is changing, that leads to changes that ripple throughout the organization, I contend. And those changes may shift to actually the deep structure of that organization, and it ripples through the constellation of actors that I'm embedded in, and ripples through the core understanding of what the organization is. And we can see this in hospitals with robotic surgery. So I'll talk a little bit about that later. But this is the core thinking of configuration work, and as that experimentation happens, and it's not, the trajectory of it is not deterministic. This happens over time and evolves. So I'd like to talk first about some work that's underway in looking at a digital transformation in Germany. This is one of Germany's largest banking groups. And it has about $1 trillion in assets. It made a strategic decision to undergo digital transformation because of this competition from online banks. So customers wanted to be able to go online and have their loan. and some of their other competitors were moving into this space. So they wanted to move into this space to have greater flexibility, but also faster and more profitable decisions. So this is kind of a unusual course that that a number of organizations are looking at as they strategically begin to think about how to go into make a digital transformation. And so we're focusing on, and I'm working with my co-authors here who are in Amsterdam, who have had I'll draw from some of their earlier work. They have been able to get good access to this firm and see kind of what's happening over time here. But this particular focus that I want to talk about today is on loan officers whose jobs were being augmented by algorithmic technologies. So what they did in this bank was to introduce a product called Clever Loan. And Clever Loan would be able to, within seconds, generate a loan approval or decision, a loan decision, approval or rejection. It generated rejection guidelines, and some of this is European guidelines required AI to be somewhat transparent. But so it generated some guidelines. It didn't generate all the information. So before Clever Loan, it was taking quite some time. There were multiple meetings with the client. It was taking sometimes weeks to get a decision, at least days to get a decision. The decisions weren't always profitable necessarily. The loan officer was advising the clients, but the loan officer was completely responsible. They worked with the client, they tried to understand what the client needed, and they provided the loan, or they made the decision. After Clever Loan was introduced, the system decided whether to approve the loan, provided the consultant with a decision, but the bank differentiated this service by keeping the loan officer in the loop. So they wanted the loan officer to deliver the decision. They didn't, because otherwise how do they differentiate themselves from an online bank? So they wanted the loan officer to be involved. However, the loan officer really had had no autonomy, but they delivered the decision to the. So just to give you a little bit of how the job changed. Before AI, the loan officer, as I said, advised the customer, made the decision, had multiple in-person meetings normally, maybe on the telephone, but usually in-person meetings and a number of forms to be filled out. They gathered loan information, they negotiated the term, they signed the contract. So they built a relationship with this customer. They usually understood this customer. They talked a lot about the customer, would come in, and these were kind of mid-sized loans. These were not big commercial loans. These were mid-sized loans. And so customers would come in with their hopes and dreams for what they were making changes in their life about. And so they wanted a new house. They had a new child, a new baby. They needed to enlarge their house, or other small business loans. They also had a lot of interactions with colleagues because there were gray areas. How do I understand what it is that I do? How should I make the decision? Can you give me advice? They got reassurance from their decisions, but they also acted as mentors to their colleagues. So there was this relationship that they had across the organization and met new colleagues. After AI, there was one in-person meeting at the end of the process to communicate the decision. No negotiation. The contract was signed. No need for interactions with the client, with other people across the organization. They complained. We did a lot. This is from in-depth number of interviews over time. They were concerned they didn't meet new people. Their job was really in terms of the relationships and the connections, as well as their status and understanding of who they were was changed. Now, there were positive consequences of this change. The bank felt like they got immediate decisions that enhanced their competitiveness. They increased their profitability. Customers' loan rejections, the loan officer did not have to think about how I reject this. I can blame it on the system. So the loan officer actually felt like it was something of a positive in that respect. So there was less attention and planning for the loan officer around that decision. However, they perceived they were losing competence. They felt like their status in the community was diminished. Prior to that, they had a lot of, they felt like they had a high-level job, a professional job that their colleagues in the community, as well as these customers, had respect for, and that was gone. Overall, they felt that they were loss of critical thinking. They were not learning. They began to see misuse of the system, incorrect data getting put in to try to kind of game the system to change the loan decision if possible. So, and the bank began to see a lot of turnover, so that the loan officers began to leave and look for different jobs. The system also was excluding certain customers. It couldn't interpret new trends, so freelancers have become much more prominent in the workforce. And the guidelines in AI, the algorithm looked for the amount of time you'd been in your job, and anybody who's applied for a loan knows that if my spouse is independent worker, and that always creates a lot of different issues. However, the system didn't distinguish very well between, just immediately gave the rejection, whereas the loan officer in the past had worked more to understand what the situation was. So this was also immigration in Germany was creating, it was really hard for the system to tell who was a new immigrant and who had just moved in for a job, and a new, say, an IT job that had come in from another European country. So the system was, and these things will be probably worked out over time, but they were systematically, a human would have seen these trends. They're also, moral burden. They felt like they often saw that an individual really couldn't afford the loan and shouldn't have this loan, even though they meet the criteria. And so they would figure out a way to reject that loan and not put that burden on the customer. They could not do that anymore, so they felt like that was an increased moral burden. So these are some of this is still in progress, and this is looking at the adoption of a system over about a 4-year time frame. I'd like to talk next about, and you can see how the loan officer's job, although the job that they were doing involved that loan decision, and the technology was matched to making that loan decision, there was a lot of work surrounding that decision and expertise that those loan officers had that was not taken into account at all in this system. And it initially enhanced things. Looks like long-term there may be some larger problems. The next area I'd like to talk about and applying kind of this same framing is looking at robotic surgery. And so I got curious a couple of years ago about understanding what was happening with robotic surgery. And a number of people started looking at this, and I got curious about it, and so I went, this is based on about a literature, looking at the literature going back to 1990. Going back really to the early 2000s, with some understanding of the idea of robotic surgery actually emerged in the early 90s, particularly around being able to treat, when the technology got to the point where we might be able to treat wounded in the first Gulf War. And so the idea that if you look at this picture, this is a promotional picture from 2000. And here you have, it's hard to see, but here you have a surgeon sitting here looking at a screen and guiding a robot at a distance, and this is at a distant location in this promotional material. And the robot arms are here, and there's someone at a distance who is near the patient, but the robot is, the idea was that the robot arms would complete the surgery, and the surgeon herself, themselves, would be at a distance controlling this. So there was in the literature, I was curious about, or just looking to see how this was conceived early. There was really no discussion in this early literature about the implications for other members of the surgical team, the nurses, scrub technicians. No thinking about that. The assumption seemed to be that a surgeon could learn to handle a robot because they understood how to perform surgery, and they would then learn to not easily, but there was no discussion of training and no discussion of changes to other aspects of the surgical process. And just to give you a little bit of the initial surgery seems to be framed as a first order change. It is intended to produce changes that enhance the benefits of conventional surgery. The laparoscopy, which was developed in the 80s and 90s, minimally invasive surgery, was a major innovation and had brought about a lot of enhancements for patients, but it had real disadvantages for the surgeon. It was physically difficult for the surgeon to perform this, and often because of fatigue, and also because of they needed the smaller hands, but trimmers, they needed dexterity. So surgical robots were really envisioned to extend the capabilities of human surgeons, and that's from 2004 in the Annals of Surgery. So what immediately happened, and I call this a first order change because it was obvious that the operating room layout had to change. And that the idea of distant surgery didn't ever seem to really happen. That was early in the literature, but what happened, what became more, one of the benefits we're seeing was with laparoscopic surgery in the same location. So the first thing that had to happen was the operating room had to change to bring in that robot. So you previously had, and still for traditional surgery, have a surgical team that's surrounding the body working together. With robotic surgery, that team is now dispersed through the operating room. You have, here is the lead surgeon looking at the computer. Here is a screen that the rest of the surgical team sees, and they're spread out through the operating room, and there's this large robot, like piece of equipment around the person. So the surgeon, the procedure is watching on the computer screen and monitoring information on the computer screen. The surgical assistant, the scrub technician are at the operating table. Okay, so the surgeon's work, I'm calling this a second order. My Apple Watch is trying to record me for some reason.
Technological change.
Right. It's telling me what I just said. Siri is. I'm not sure why. So the work that the surgeon was actually doing now is changed fundamentally. Because the surgeon attention is on the console screen. So the surgeon no longer is the task. Formally, the surgeon gained information from the body, from touching the body, from seeing the body, from being right there. And this became a more. It's shifted from this taken for granted process of using my hands and my physical senses and my brain, obviously, to understand. What actions to take to integrating the information from the computer into this process. And this word by Dean, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, is very good in talking about the real distinct changes. And when Bean talks about that, you're not just tying a knot anymore. You're thinking about how to tell the robot how to tie a knot. So, and you're using a joystick, and you're physically doing a lot of different things in order to do this work. The communication changed dramatically in the operating room. Multiple studies show more communication because you had these screens all over the place, and they're having to tell each other what this makes sense of this information in the operating room. So I'm trying to go quickly because I think I'm running out of time. Okay, the nurses. This was not discussed at all until about, I've forgotten exactly when, but 7 or 8 years ago. There was really no discussion of the change in the nurse's job that I could find in the literature. But clearly, the entire surgical team changed. The nurse had to know how to put together this equipment. The nurses also are now the closest people to the body in the operating room. The surgeon is at a distant location. So the nurse has more, and often a resident is there, but there is more in case something changes, that they have to be prepared to act quickly. They have to interpret information, react to information. Also, their job changed because, and this happened not only with the surgeon, but with laparoscope, as it became more useful, there was additional responsibility that nurses had to take on. The surgical residents, the residency changed. They previously had learned by observing the surgeon. They now were much more likely to work with simulation and watching videos, and not able to, not having the same type of training. And in fact, this has really led to a new professional identity. And it was not anticipated that I could find anywhere that there would be two different professions. I mean, now they are really, you cannot do both. It's understood that you are a robotic surgeon, or you have the training for robotic surgery, and you have the training, or you go through a different residency, somewhat different for traditional surgery. There was definitely unintended institutional transformation, because you cannot afford to have Northwestern can, and UIC can, and Rush can have a robotic surgery, and you can have multiple operating rooms that are built in multiple ways. Mid-level hospitals cannot afford to have both, and so what JAMA is looking at says, this came out, this was in 2019 in JAMA, and it continues to be a concern that hospitals are investing, mid-level hospitals are investing in robotic surgery rooms, setting it up, hiring the right people, and then beginning to have to use that to make money. So is it always being used? In fact, I think it's this article that said, the only thing that's consistent, or another one, the only consistent outcome is that it always costs more. A lot of this is not necessarily bringing better patient quality. In certain areas it is, but in certain areas it's bringing the same patient quality at more cost, which is unintentional. So I'd just like to end by saying that this is not deterministic. This happened over time as people tried to understand how to do this work and integrate this work and perform their job in the way that they had been trained to do. But what I think I'd like to say is that this is not going to reduce, anytime we drop AI in, it won't reinforce and enhance existing work practices, I don't believe. It will change those work practices. And how that change occurs requires innovation and experimentation and more thought, I think, on our part as we think about how we design work systems, but also how we step back and design, and this is another, but I think what I'd like to end with is this as we add the technology to solve a known problem, we're going to reconfigure that problem and reconfigure its context. And that's going to lead to consequential changes for the individual and the organization. And I think that this privileging the technology like this without understanding how the work is embedded in those relationships may lead to unintended consequences that can be very consequential. And I wonder, I think that it's very useful perhaps that we look beyond adopting that technology to how it's designed, and that we partner that with thinking about more than efficiency, but thinking about humanistic goals in terms of the individual who's working in this. I think there are larger societal goals that are also getting lost in this focus on efficiency. So I think there is a lot of work to be done. Efficiency is still going to be very important, and consistent. AI obviously can make consistent decisions and good decisions, but I think there's a lot more to think about more broadly as we move so quickly into this dropping AI into the organization. So maybe I'll do that.
We have time, about 20 minutes for questions and answers.
Okay.
So I can help you those questions.
Okay. Yes.
This is part of I think, a bigger problem in our society is focus on efficiency
Yeah.
and not looking very often at the bigger picture. And I call it the rest of the picture is resilience.
Yeah.
And we saw it with, just-in-time manufacturing was another example. What
Yeah.
happened in hospital where they cut staffing because it was more efficient. And I think the pandemic has kind of unraveled that what we did to ourselves as a society with obsession on efficiency and ignoring the bigger picture.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's not a new, but you're right, it's not a new issue, it's just a new technology.
It's another facet.
And it's another facet, and it's the way we're deframing things. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I really agree with the framework, and I also think that unintended consequences will be huge. And I just wonder, is this specific to AI, or is this a case where both the bank and the hospital needs to add the computer science personnel or computer science expertise? And if you think of any case when an organization needs to add an N+1 expertise, creates more social complexity and kind of inter-field tensions and gaps in networks, or is it something qualitatively different from that?
Personally, I think the interdisciplinary
Yeah.
aspect and bringing the user in and really, and I think, I mean, we saw this, I'm an old-time information systems person, and we saw this with how you design systems long ago, that people could not tell you what they did. They always told you the outcome and how they got to that outcome. And so even they are not appreciative of the scope of what it takes. But I think we've learned a lot in 20 years, I hope. But we continue to, I think that there are a lot of reasons that are societal that we continue to think of efficiency as the primary goal. So I'm wondering if we can't try to enhance maybe our thinking about what efficiency is, and also think about relational and other aspects of a job in terms of its design, really push people. Because the literature is very clear that these, for example, that relational aspects of jobs have huge implications for how people act in an organization, how pro-social they are, how much they're going to support other people, what it means for their social relationships. So I'm not sure how to get that message in, but education is part of it, I think.
Yep.
It's really interesting, but it's an enduring problem, right? I mean, Nancy's human factors. This is a long-standing that systems are designed without thinking about what are the effects on human and the broader workflow that's going to take place. DoD spends a lot of money trying to fix systems that weren't designed really thinking about how humans are going to use them. And I think what's interesting about what you're talking about is that AI has far more potential.
The boundary. I mean, so we buy a piece of equipment. It sort of has a clear boundary for what it's going to do, and we can train people to kind of fix or do workarounds for poor system design. But AI is so open that I think it's a much fuzzier boundary that has much more potential to have substantially bigger unintended consequences.
Yeah, that's true.
And while some of them are likely to be positive, my bet is mostly they'll be negative.
But we could perhaps not always think about substituting I mean, I have a PhD student, and I know there are people in here who is trying to think about where is it, how can they collaborate? How can we, because some of the outcomes for the bank were good, and you cannot, the numbers are too big for a lot of these loan officers to really understand, but the human side of it was just completely ignored. And that's a long-standing problem, but AI has a more potential to work in partnership, I think.
But you've got this particular AI from this vendor that's being sold to a lot of companies, so it's a one-off. Now you got this other AI from a different company that's agnostic about this one, and this other. So what you have is this sort of accidental interjection of these new pieces of systems that will have unintended consequences.
And I think this is really interesting because it's so interesting that you pick the loan officer, because it's the industry I've been working on
Is that
for
right?
many years now. Yeah, and we have a diversity panel tomorrow where I'm going to bring some of this stuff up. But what's really interesting is I think the loan officer, you didn't mention this, but there's also a lot of bias there.
with the loan of the
Yeah, in any type of loan decision, you look at the person, and they used to make a decision: do I give this loan to this person or not? Well, a human making this decision means that human's biased. And today, the inequality in lending is higher than in 1969. One black person getting a loan means 5 white people got a loan. And loan officers are humans, right? They're biased. The other hand is, though, the machine is biased too.
Yes, exactly.
Because you train the machine with biased data, because the AI is trained on historical loan data, which is mostly white people or prime customers, right?
Right.
So you exclude part of the population because the machine wasn't trained on those people, right? The machine is trained on prime customers, not on subprime customers. Subprime and prime is our terms determining the FICO band, right? And so I think there's so much potential in AI providing help in making unbiased decisions by using more information, but you need to somehow regulate it and make sure that it's trained correctly and uses all and unbiased information. And then it could be super cool, because then you can really augment the human, make sure that all information is used, no biases are introduced, and you can be faster, of course, and all those efficiency gains. And so I'm really interested in the regulation ideas that they're going to come up with, because we have tried to regulate the financial industry with the CFPB, the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, and so on, and it hasn't worked well. So it's so interesting to see how our society will be shaped around those topics, right, with AI. I love it. Yeah.
Yes.
I have more of a literature question, because this is not my area of specialty being communication, but as someone who's looked at a lot the automation crisis of the 1960s, how much of what happened with industrial automation informs current research? Especially as someone from the Midwest and from the Rust Belt.
I think there's a framing of it.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, like, how much of that currently helps to inform the literature and think about these things, because I feel like we've seen them all before, but in different ways.
Yes,
right. So
the thing is, the technology is different, and I think there's an opportunity to it's so open. There's an opportunity to have it be more beneficial. Work in more. Use what's good for the technology. What the technology can do really well, and the human can do really well, and somehow put those together. But that's not what vendors are doing, and I think a lot of it is informed by the thinking from the manufacturing area, where efficiency, and the tax code does it to us. The tax code says invest in machines, don't invest in people. So there are a lot of social issues that are driving this, that are not easily. But I don't think, but this has got the potential to have much bigger consequences.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to follow up on that, because, so there's always disruption by technology, steam engine, personal computer. And what concerns me a little bit is the use of the term AI is overused and non-specific, right? And so, in fact, if you look at why all of ChatGPT got a big, it has to do with the fact on how it presented information through language, right? But in my own opinion, where it's highly constrained in what it can do. It's not like some general purpose intelligence. And we've been doing for actually up until about 4 years ago, this was all called machine learning.
Yes, and it should be now.
And now it's called AI for no apparent reason except the media. So I think it would be interesting, and I don't know if our group can do that, is to try to be specific about the different technologies in this space and how they might, a big problem, quite honestly, is AI, or whatever you want to call it, it's filled with bias, because it, like was said, that's the data, right? And we're going to train the AI, so we're always going to put that bias in unless there's regulation. But we know that regulation's not perfect. So I just think that part of this thinking about, is AI really that different than when the steam engine came in? Or is it just a different way it's going to disrupt the workforce? I don't know, but
Yeah.
probably you know much more than me in terms of the literature.
Yeah, that's all. But I do think looking back at the design is critical, and I don't think the technology companies have any real reason to do that. They're working with. I mean, we're actually trying to look at the AI, the robotic surgery vendors to try to understand, how because they're being guided by the hospital with what and the hospital, and I think, people are thinking about the current situation and looking for a solution to that current situation by working with vendors and funding vendors, and vendors have incentive to solve that current situation also. But I think that whole system is not.
And I think it's
set up
clever
for failure.
loan. I have worked with companies like that, and they're obviously driven by who's buying their product, which is the bank. The bank loves all the stuff, even on the negative side that you showed, because it's more efficient. They don't actually care if loan officers leave. Just get
They're
one,
making
right.
I think it's creating a brittle organization as we go forward.
And I think if you
And I think it's got terrible social consequences.
Yeah, you're putting loan decisions, which is the basis of our society in many ways, into the hands of a vendor, right? I mean, that's really dangerous.
We have time for one more question.
So I'm curious about what happened after you shared your results with Cleverloan, and specifically on the idea that sometimes the algorithm wasn't so effective and it would have been useful for a human to be in there. Did they at all think about maybe we should have people have the opportunity to override or defer and have like a little bit more interaction, or is that just outside the scope of the way they think about things?
At the moment, I don't know about that because I'm not sure about the answer to that question. I don't know. I think he's right. At the moment, they don't. They're more profitable. They're able to, compete in a way that they had to figure out how to compete. Is it sustainable? I can't imagine that it is. I think that the bank, but I think that it probably is going to lead to, some transformation of what the bank is all about and how does the bank deliver its products. And but I don't know that they have. I think he might be right that I don't know the specific answer to your question, but I'm not sure they care at the moment.
Interesting, yeah.
So,
Right. Can we do a round of applause for our next presenter is Hatim Rothman. Hatim is an assistant professor of management and organizations here at the Kellogg School of Management. And the title of his presentation is called Control in the Age of Algorithms, Exploring the Cold Start Problem and Reputational Interdependence on Online Labor Markets. So a round of applause for